This man had to be shot twice by a firing squad. He was tortured by the KGB for craving his freedom. He earned sentences totaling 83 years in Stalin's Gulag, in part because he proved to be among that era's most skillful masters of escape, living by the credo that even the most precarious freedom is better than the safest imprisonment. Ironically, he, the escaped prisoner, was eventually to receive one of the USSR's highest state decorations for achievements in labor. He was one of the organizers of the Gulag inmates' insurgents against the regime. While inside, he made the acquaintance of many people, including even the last emperor of China. He was later nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. But for the former prisoners, he will always remain foremost a symbol of courage and determination. Feared by the prison officials, the words "runaway," prone to escape, were written in his file.
It is much better to be in constant fear and on the outside than without fear and in jail. That is why I escaped. Besides, I wasn't the man who easily surrenders to the dire twists of fate.
Today, an 80-year-old former prisoner will walk the same road as 56 years ago, when he fled injustice, violence, and humiliation, seeking the highest human goal: freedom. The history of mankind is riddled with the massacres of innocent people. But the 20th century stands unparalleled in its record of atrocities. Nazi crimes and carnage have been well publicized. A clear picture has been painted of the hell of those concentration camps, of the gas chambers, of the broken families, and the loss of millions of lives. But what is known about the evil of Stalin's regime from the 1930s to the 1950s? To this day, archives remain classified and stashed away in the dark basement cells of the KGB descendants. At least 10 million people have been subject to oppression and executed.
The word Gulag is mostly associated with Siberia and permafrost. In reality, this is an abbreviation of the Russian words, the main administration of camps. Thousands of camps were strewn around the whole of the Soviet Union and were managed by the MVD, the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the USSR. The supply to the MVD of the political prisoners, the so-called enemies of the people, whose confessions were extorted through torture at the interrogations, was carried out by the State Security Council, which was later renamed into an ominously sounding KGB.
The KGB and the Gulag were repressive machines, striving by the most refined methods to suppress any manifestation of freedom or individuality that arose from the citizens. Gaining entrance to the Gulag camps was as simple as cracking a joke about Stalin among friends.
There were some women plucking tea in the tea plantation, and they had a team leader who said that cheese was cheaper in the market than in the state stores. One of the women must have been a KGB agent. She turned him in and he was arrested, sentenced to 80 years. There was a singer, Pechkovsky. He, a famous singer, once performed in Riga, during German occupation of that town. How dared he sing there, and he was sentenced by the communists to 10 years. There were other, more serious causes too. The Soviet soldiers who'd been taken POWs by Nazis, after returning home, were by all means sent to Gulag as traitors of the motherland. Generally, traitor of the motherland label was pinned on everyone, especially the clever representatives of intelligentsia and former aristocracy, who, in the understanding of the Soviet authorities, were hampering or could in some way hinder the building of the so-called radiant future and the communist mentality.
Among Gulag inmates, there was included another category of people. The evil of the Soviet Empire had unintentionally induced the strongest and freest representatives of the society to create secret anti-communist organizations, mainly in the Ukraine and the Caucasus, for the purpose of toppling Soviet power. Their members, after being exposed, were either executed or sent to the Gulag, the place where the value of human life was less than the cost of the bullet for their execution. Some of the former prisoners are alive even today, residing everywhere in the world from Japan to the United States. Despite the unimaginable conditions in the camp, there were some people whose strong will could not be broken, even by the Gulag. They fought to the end, each in his own way, and survived. The story of one Gulag runaway, Chabua Amiredjibi, testified to the strength that some prisoners found.
How can I characterize Chabua Amiredjibi? Among my friends, I haven't had many such chivalrous, brave, honest men who would never want to trample the same place.
Chabua Amiredjibi is descended from one of the oldest Georgian aristocratic families, a family whose roots can be traced to the beginning of the 9th century, and a family which had many members sacrifice their lives for the freedom of their country. In 1918, Chabua's father managed to hoist the flag of the Georgian Republic above the palace of the Russian Tsar's viceroy in Tbilisi. His uncle was a member of the parliament of the pre-communist independent Georgian Republic, and later became one of the organizers of an unsuccessful national uprising against Soviet power, which had annexed the country in 1921. Once in possession of their usurped power, the communists dealt terribly with dissent. Chabua's family could not avoid oppression.
My father was expecting arrest in 1937, but managed to remain out. He was arrested in 1938. As it turned out later, he had not been executed. He had been killed by a hammer. They hit him on the head with a hammer. My mother was arrested along with my dad in 1938. She spent 3 years in prison and then was released. She was rearrested in 1943 and spent 10 years in prisons and camps.
In spite of their difficult paths, young Chabua followed his parents' footsteps. At the beginning of the 1940s in Georgia, idealistic young people, craving freedom, formed an underground organization, the St. George, which had the ambitious goal of overthrowing Soviet power in Georgia. His destiny and a responsibility to his homeland brought 20-year-old Chabua Amiredjibi to this organization.
Most of us were young, 20, 23 years old, with some older people as well.
Without allowing any expansion of their activities, the KGB cracked down on the St. George. The leader was killed during the arrest, and Chabua, alongside the other members of the organization, was detained and placed in prison. This was his first true test. He was tortured almost to death. The KGB wanted him to inform on the other members of the organization who were not yet known to the authorities. Chabua, though severely beaten, found enough power in himself to smirk at their request for information. "You'll not get anything out of me, comrade interrogator." "Let's see if that grin will change in a little while," retorted the interrogator. The interrogator called for a dental surgeon.
The surgeon took out the pliers. "Open your mouth," he said. I obliged. I was not given any anesthetic. He dragged out one of my teeth. I lost consciousness. The surgeon gave me sniffing salts to regain senses. The interrogator asks again, "Will you give us the information now or not?" I don't remember many details of the conversation. "I've already told you what I could," I answered. "Open up your mouth." Dentist pulled yet another tooth. I fainted again. He extracted a third tooth. I passed out again. He pulled out the fourth, a front one.
The young man had 6 healthy teeth pulled out, one after the other, without anesthetic. The time for his trial had come. The judge asked Chabua, "What would you do if we released you?" "I would do the same things as before," was the answer. Chabua was sentenced to 25 years, but the prosecutor insisted on execution. Chabua spent 45 days and nights on death row, in KGB solitary confinement cell number 9, awaiting the execution that came near with the sound of every footstep in the corridors.
Somebody was constantly screaming at night. This was being done on purpose, to shatter one's psyche. The KGB had a wide range of torture methods. For example, they would put you in the corner, facing the wall, and order you to stand on one foot. You had to remain that way until you collapsed. Guards would take turns watching you. Another widely used method was to insert pencils between your fingers and squeeze. They would also beat you with iron rods, put you in the flooded hole, and lots more.
As a matter of principle, the Communist court seldom reversed a decision. Chabua was lucky. The initial verdict stood: 25 years of correctional labor in the Gulag system. Thus, he escaped being executed by firing squad for the first time in his life, and found himself in the camp of the sparkling wine factory in Tbilisi, Georgia, wherefrom he was to be transferred to Siberia, the remotest of the Gulag camps. Wary of this destination, Chabua decided to run away before he was sent to Siberia. Thus his career as a runaway began. This, his first and longest run, was to be marked by luck and incredible coincidence.
It was July of 1945. All the Soviet armed forces were redeployed to the east for the war with Japan. All the tracks to Siberia were overcrowded by military, so prisoners were kept waiting in the local institutions of Gulag system, the towns where they were arrested.
At that time, the colony was located on the slope of a hill, 3 kilometers west of Tbilisi.
There were barracks and a dining hall, where there is a field now. Over the road, around the factory, the prisoners were constructing new buildings of the winemaking plant and working in the shops.
The shops were all underground, enormous wine cellars with huge tunnels. There was only one entrance, which was guarded. Railroad tracks approached the factory from the south. The entire perimeter of the colony was easily surveyed from atop guard towers. Guards were stationed at all the doors inside the factory. They escorted the prisoners from work to the barracks and back, counting them each time.
I had prepared everything beforehand. I grew a beard, which according to the plan I was intending to shave off just before going. Through the friends outside, I took care to get a passport and an army certificate. I studied all the movements and schedule of the prisoners and guards in the camp. I prepared clothes and all the necessary things for my escape. I worked out a detailed plan of action. I had also found a place where it would be easiest to break through.
Chabua spent 4 months preparing for escape, but the first thing he did was to ask a fellow inmate to tattoo St. George across his chest, which marked for all to see his membership in the underground anti-communist organization known as the St. George.
I knew that should I get caught during the escape, and upon seeing that tattoo, guards would definitely shoot me on the spot as a member of the St. George organization. That fact made me extra careful and vigorous at the same time.
So Chabua had almost everything ready for his escape. It was the 20th of September 1945, but he wasn't going to run away that day, as he did not yet have the necessary documents, which were to be brought to him by his close friend, a winemaker, who had a free pass to the factory. After breakfast, Chabua, as usual, went down to the basement to check his cachet.
Here, I was hiding my shaving accessories, clothes, and other things for my departure. Suddenly, I saw a man rummaging through my bundle of accessories. He didn't hear me sneaking up to him. This was Bechai, a thief. He was taken off guard. "What you looking for?" He couldn't answer. "These things yours?" "Mine." After a short spell of silence, he asked, "Mind if I come along?" Thinking it over a little, I responded, "I wasn't going to run away today, but as it so happens that you have learned about this, I have to do it now. I'll take you along, but we will escape according to my plan. As soon as we are back from the dinner and the guards have checked the basement and resumed their position by the doors, I'll give you a sign and we'll go. But you have to stick by me and not talk to anyone in the basement or in the dining hall. There's a rat among the thieves, so the warden knows all about your conversations. You talk and the escape goes bust. You got it? I'll do as you say."
After lunch was over, around 1:30, the prisoners were pushed to the basement. The guards checked the place. 2 of them stood in the doorway, the others lined up the second shift for lunch. This procedure took time. They had to gather all the prisoners, count them, escort them out of the building, and count them again.
Having given the lockpick to Bechai, which I prepared beforehand for the massive metal doors that opened out on the backyard, I shaved off beard and changed clothes. I could hear metal clanking far away. This meant that Bechai unlocked the lock and threw it away. A sneaking suspicion crept over me. Why would he make unnecessary noise? I hurried towards the exit as each second mattered.
Chabua had calculated everything precisely. There was no sentry on the watchtower. He had escorted the second shift of prisoners to lunch, and the escort from the first shift would only get up on the tower about 20 minutes later. The fugitives had to jump down to a concrete slab on the first floor.
I jumped down. Bechai also jumped but didn't close the door behind him, so the shaft of light was going straight into the basement, and the guard could notice this.
According to Chabua's plan, they would cross the river, cover a few kilometers along the right bank of the river towards Tbilisi, cross the river back and keep going on towards the town. This way, if the guards with their dogs chased them, they would lose track and the fugitives would peacefully make their way to the town along the left bank.
We came to the river. I took my clothes off, tucked them up in a bundle, which I tied to my head in order for them not to get wet. But at this time I heard from behind, "I won't come in, I can't swim." I turned around, Bechai stood dressed. "You grew up near the water and you can't swim. Don't be scared, it's shallow here. I'll help." He obeyed. The river Kura ran low. Only about 10 meters away from the bank it was deeper. That's where I had to help him. We came out onto the right bank. We barely managed to get dressed and run through nearby gardens when 2 shots rang out. The guards triggered the escape alarm.
The warden reacted fairly quickly, unleashed a chase, and informed the KGB about the escape. This was where the operative agents, the so-called OPERs, came in. They searched for the fugitive throughout the whole town, in the streets, police precincts and commandant's office, and of course in the places of their actual residence.
I remember as the men in black leather coats filled our 2-room apartment. They were searching under the beds, the bathroom, the balcony, and the neighbors' apartments. To be short, they were turning place upside down.
Fortunately, the fugitives were still alive. They crossed the river back to the left bank, but neither of them had any documents. But they had to get them somehow.
When we got to Tbilisi, Bechai said that in the southern district of the town, he had some friends, also thieves. He was hoping they might have documents for us. We went there. The war had just ended, and most people were very bad off. Yet they treated us to wine and even some food, though they had no stone documents that we could use for a little while. Then we decided to cross back to the right bank, but this time over the bridge.
Chabua wanted to contact the people who had been trying to deliver the documents to him back in the camp, but to do that, they had to cross the bridge. To get to the bridge, they had to cross the main street through the crossroads, all the corners of which were guarded by patrolling servicemen who were checking documents of passers-by, especially young people. No matter where they crossed the main street, they would necessarily come across a patrol.
In any situation, there's always a way out, and I found it. It was like this. We crossed the street and entered this building with cash desks. We waited till the patrol was out of sight and went to cross the street. I was front. Bechai followed me. We crossed the street and turned left, towards the bridge. But having not even gone 5 steps, we bumped into the patrol, which turned up there as if from nowhere. They stopped me and demanded documents. Shooting stopped. Finally, I turned around. There was nobody, and I went on my way, but now with a calm and purposeful step. I was about 10 steps short of the end of the bridge when a truck screeched to a stop by me, and the patrollers jumped out of it. Hands up. I could do nothing else but stop. I don't know what happened to me, but I didn't obey and I didn't raise my hands. I just crossed them behind my back.
Chabua was apprehended, but fortunately, this was a military patrol, which had nothing to do with the penitentiary system. The patrollers brought Chabua back to the crossroads. Bechai and 2 other detainees were already there. Tbilisi was a small town then with a population of around 300,000. Among the pedestrians, there were also people Chabua knew. He opened a newspaper, which he grabbed from the company of the thieves, covered his face, and with it pretended to be reading. His uncle showed up, passed by, but luckily didn't notice his nephew. But you could not hide using this method from the Oper's alert eyes, searching for the fugitives all over town. You could only count on luck and the Lord that the Oper's car would not appear for some time more.
At around 3:30, we were finally sent to the military commandant's office by truck. For me, they reported to the officer of the day. He tried to run away, but was apprehended. I introduced myself as George Maisuradze, a student of the university, living at 33 Gogol Street. It is to be noted that Bechai and I, when asked about our permanent residence, gave names of streets within the authority of the same, the 9th Police Precinct. The officer of the day diligently took down our names and locked us up in a dark, damp basement. Around half an hour later, the officer summoned us, me and Bechai, together. I suddenly noticed that there was an unfamiliar officer at the table, not the one who had received us.
A replacement came to the commandant's office at 5 o'clock, and the previous officer of the day left, forgetting to deliver the data on Chabua to his substitute. Moreover, he had even forgotten to record in the register that Chabua had tried to run away from the patrol. Thanks to this God-given gift, Chabua went from being a fugitive to once again being an ordinary citizen who had merely forgotten his documents at home.
I think that this happy incident was also part of my streak of luck. Looking through the file, the officer asked some questions and sent us to the 9th Police Precinct under a guard. We were led along this street. A truck passed by. There was a personnel from our factory in it. Our eyes crossed, but fortunately for us, these were the winemakers and not the KGB. They recognized us, but didn't betray us. We got lucky again.
At around 6 in the evening, the convoy brought the fugitives to this police department right in downtown Tbilisi. The Opers, the KGB men, could come in at any time to check for the fugitives, who could have easily been caught by the police, which, in fact, was what had happened.
As I've already stated, there's no situation from which there's no way out. This has been the motto of my life from the birth. I had to think hard in those circumstances to find my way out. This effort yielded results. Having sat thus for a while, studying the situation, I finally addressed the officer on duty. "Sir, could I talk to you?" "Go ahead," he replied. Coming close to him, I whispered, "Dear officer, what's the use of us being here? Let one of us out and he will bring the documents for both of us. I can't promise you a lot, but I could scrape together 300 rubles as a token of our respect." The officer, brooding over my proposal for quite a while, finally made a decision. "Go and bring them," he ordered Bechai. The officer hadn't even finished when Bechai was on the move. I managed to grab him by his sleeve. "Tell my mother to enclose 300 rubles with the documents." These words were uttered so that the officer could hear them. I knew I was seeing Bechai for the last time. He could not in reality go to the prison where my mother was. Even if he would manage to do that, my documents were safely stored in the archives of the KGB. All went according to my scenario. I played the role of a 300-ruble hostage. Now everything depended on whether the Opers would come in within about an hour and a half. Whatever the case, the situation was in my favor.
While the officer was waiting for his money out in the street, there was another coincidence. A policeman who knew Chabua came into the precinct. The runaway covered himself and pretended to be asleep. The policeman chatted on the phone for half an hour, after which he left the place without even looking in the direction of the detained person. The Opers were not coming, and the officer came back to the room only after the policeman left. Another possible disaster had been averted. Chabua asked the officer for permission to speak to him again.
"Dear officer," I started in a low voice, "he's been gone for a long time. It looks very suspicious. Going to Gogol Street doesn't take 2 hours. Suppose the guy is a deserter or a criminal. He came to my mother, took the documents and money and vanished in thin air." The officer sunk in thoughts again. Finally, freeing himself from the spell, he asked promptly, "Where do you live?" 33 Gogol Street. I stood on what I'd said.
The officer took the receiver, and Chabua's mistake began to materialize. He was calling the police inquiry office to find out whether a certain Amiredjibi was actually living at 33 Gogol Street. There was a long drawn-out pause. They were looking for the information. The officer finally hung up and beckoned a sentry. The policeman ordered the sentry to escort the detainee to Gogol Street and come back with the documents. An incredible thing had happened. It turned out that Amiredjibi was actually living at 33 Gogol Street. Having only mentioned that name earlier in desperation, Chabua benefited from the fact that around 5% of Tbilisi residents had that family name. As for the address, such a coincidence happens only once in a lifetime, or never. So Chabua, with his luck, had hit the bullseye again. After such a gift from God, it seemed that nothing would stop Chabua from escaping the police. Some minutes later, he, accompanied by his escort, was walking the streets of his native district, where each yard, with all its entrances and exits, was perfectly known to him.
Luck is preconditioned by your destiny. I believe in destiny because I believe in God. It was due to sheer luck that I survived 3 times during that flight. First, I ran away from the camp. Then I escaped the patrol and shooting on the bridge. And finally, I dodged a policeman. Things worked out perfectly in my favor. Isn't that luck?
The thief, Bekai, also managed to hide, but he was less lucky and was soon arrested and served his sentence to the end. But as for Chabua, his flight continued. That night and the following day, Chabua spent at the cemetery among the gravestones of the nameless victims of Stalin's regime. As soon as it became dark, the runaway contacted his friends, acquired the necessary documents, and a couple of days later, leaving himself in the hands of God and St. George, he headed for the northern Caucasus to start a new life there under a false name, constantly under the threat of being identified by Stalin's authorities. There he, the escaped prisoner, started to work at the forest range in one of the woodworking plants. Being a good organizer, he soon became a brigade leader, and later even a manager of the plant. He married and had 2 daughters.
Their romance before the marriage had lasted a year, and all the time my mother had known nothing about his previous life, what was really happening to him, because father had to keep it all a secret, and he was leading a normal and open life. He was earning so much at the factory that he could invite not only my mother and my uncle, but also their friends to restaurants and treat them with lavishness, which had become characteristic of him. That's why nobody on my mother's side of the family would ever suspect that he was a runaway convict who was hiding from the KGB and other people who'd been after him all the time. These were post-war years. He lived with the false documents. He was known then as Levan Georgadze.
Even as Chabua was leading his life out in the open, danger loomed around each corner. One sunny day, Chabua entered a pub for a beer.
It was a basement pub with only the upper half of the windows passing light. A car stopped. The KGB men got out. One told the other, "Let's have a drink before the driver changes the tire." They came down the stairs. Suddenly, I recognized an officer who knew my face. I stood so that he wouldn't see me, although I could still observe him. I was drinking. They drank and left. I had a gun ready. I would have fought them if identified, as I wasn't going to surrender alive.
The concept of human fate did not exist for the Soviet authorities. Stalin could, in one night, move the whole nation, say from the Caucasus to the Far East, or vice versa. In accordance with that same principle, in 1948, the whole plant, together with the personnel, was moved to Belarus. Chabua and his family were moved there too. In Belarus, another incredible thing happened, which determined the rest of Chabua Amiredjibi's life. After having won the war, the USSR took everything from devastated Germany that could be transported, including equipment for different factories and plants. Ironically, the officials provided documents to the Gulag Runaway, who was already hiding under a false identity, and sent him to Germany to haul out the equipment for the woodworking plant.
My chief engineer, a KGB representative, and I were sent to Frankfurt am Main, West Germany. I procured the equipment, loaded it on the train, and sent it home.
Frankfurt at that time was under the control of the Western Allied forces. Chabua could request political asylum in any of the embassies of these democratic countries and become a free man.
Why should I have stayed there? What for? I didn't really want to. I had my country, my relatives, my people, my house, my yard. How could I be happy there, knowing that my family would become an object of harassment here? Deep inside of me, I believed that even if I were caught, I didn't have to worry, because I hadn't committed any crime or killed anyone. They didn't shoot you after the first escape. They just doubled the sentence. After the second, they did, but that provision was annulled in 1951. Moreover, I had been put up for a decoration courtesy of Belarusians as a reward for building the woodworking plant in half-time of schedule.
Without hesitation, Chabua traded a comfortable life abroad for the well-being of his relatives and the dream that one day he would again see his native town and Georgia. Chabua's bosses, humorously, deemed it necessary to encourage the work of a successful employee. They decided to decorate the manager of the enterprise with the highest order possible for workers at that time, the Order of the Red Banner. Chabua knew that someday he would be arrested, and that this order might somehow benefit him. Strange as it may seem, Chabua probably would have received that order had it not been for one thing.
In 1947, the communists introduced a new practice. It was called Госпроверка, state checks. All over the Soviet Union, each and every person was checked in order to prevent penetration of spies into the country. I was also checked. It was a state check that exposed me, not the decoration.
Он пришел после работы вечером домой, сел обедать, потом
He came home in the evening after work, dined and began to play with me. He made a playpen for me with his own hands and was very proud that he'd made it himself and that I was very happy in it. Then we heard a knock on the door and 3 men dressed in civilian clothes entered the room. "So, who are you?" they asked him. "You must be Levan Giorgadze." "Yes," he replied. "Get dressed, please. You must come with us." Mother did not understand anything at the moment, but father did. As my mother said, he took a lot of time parting with me. She said, he took me out of the playpen, kissed me a lot.
Он говорит, тебя взял из манежа. Очень долго целовал.
On December 27, 1949, his flight, lasting 4 years and 3 months, characterized by all the unpredictable vicissitudes of life, as well as by incredible luck, had ended. Chabua was then 28 years old. But luck followed Chabua even in his future life in the Gulag, as if St. George did not ever intend to part with the runaway. For 10 more years, Chabua knocked around the camps of Siberia and the Far East. 3 more times he broke out of the camps. On the 8th of August 1951, Chabua fled from the Far East.
Escape from Karaganda had been in preparation for a long time. As early as winter, when we were putting a fence up around a new labor camp, we didn't put concrete around 2 of the pickets, but poured water instead, and when water froze, it kept the pickets upright. We were also stealing gasoline from the incoming trucks, which were stored safely, as we were intending to break out by a truck. There was one German from Tbilisi, a very good guy. He was delivering water to the prison zone in a truck. I was standing on the right-hand step of the truck. We were covering ourselves with the shields. What saved me was that the sentry who was on my side of the tower got confused. First, he decided to come down, then ran up the stairs again and started shooting, but it was too late. We were already beyond the parapet. The sentry standing on the left side killed the Ukrainian Lapka, but Lapka's shield saved Schulz, the driver. In short, we got out.
Before the guards came to and unleashed a chase, the fugitives covered about 30 kilometers, but the fuel and spare tanks were punctured, and the truck stopped.
We went on foot, Schulz and me, together, separately from the other two. 2 lives had been lost in this escape. We continued our way and finally came upon a village. We hid low in the bushes. A woman came out of the house, went up the ladder to the loft, fetched some hay from there and took it to the cattle shed. When she went into the cattle shed, we rushed out and quietly climbed the ladder to the loft. There were piles of hay there. We were dead tired, so we fell asleep. Five or 6 hours passed by. Schulz wakes me up. Look, he says. I looked out of the window, and there was a truck full of soldiers out there in the yard.
It's not clear whether it was the owner of the house informing the authorities or the dogs coming upon the track from the abandoned truck, but the fugitives were found.
Some time passed. The officer yelled, "Come out, guys. We are not the camp convoy. We are the administrative staff. We'll take you to the 16th prison." There was nothing else we could do, so we went out. Had the camp's guard caught us, they would take us to the camp's gate and shoot us immediately to warn others. But these people kept their word and took us to the 16th prison. It was real hell, but it was better than death. That's how it happened.
The stories of Chabua's deeds spread throughout the Gulag. He was very much respected by his fellow prisoners. Old-timers, his friends, also remember stories about his escapes.
One of his famous escapes is when he ran away from West Siberia. It was a new camp under construction, and the punishment cells were made of wood. He was placed in one of those cells. A drill had been delivered to him by friends. He drilled the wall. He couldn't use a saw as everybody would hear the noise. He drilled the wall and crept out. He crept out and ran away. And when he ran, he had a high temperature. He was trembling. And this was during winter. It was -50. He was running along the rail track. He was being chased. He could hear the dogs barking. He stopped short in his tracks, sat down, covered his face with the palms of his hands and said, "You can't get sick. You can't get sick." When he stood up, the temperature was no longer that high. Then he ran, came to some village and hid there. They would have killed him by all means, as he was very notorious for his escapes. Nobody would have showed mercy.
Had he been overtaken by the pursuers, his body would have been hung at the gates of the camp he had run away from, as a warning to other would-be fugitives. But he was lucky here too. Only 3 days later, he was arrested by the employees of a special prison for violation of the camp regime. Eventually, there was a big inscription made in red in the Gulag file for Chabua Amiredjibi: Runaway, prone to escape. All the prison officials had to fear the professional prison breaker, because when somebody escaped from the prison, officials from that prison were punished severely by the Gulag administration. This is why they started transferring Chabua from camp to camp, so that he would never be able to stay long enough to plan another breakout. It was during this time that he met people of many different backgrounds, who had also been trapped in the Gulag. Among them, there was the last Chinese emperor, Puyi, who had been arrested by the Soviets and kept in the Gulag until his extradition by the Chinese authorities.
I was transferred to Dubovka, Middle Asia, and prisoners told me, "This is Puyi, the Manchurian emperor." He was short, very handsome, very polite, and of course very educated. He knew Western European languages perfectly, as well as world history and literature. Besides, one can always tell who's who. He said that the Japanese had compelled him to become the Manchurian emperor. He was entitled to the throne by his descent. For certain reasons he was against it, but the Japanese would kill him and exterminate all his relatives, so he had to agree. This may or may not have been the truth, but that's what he said. This is what I can say. I was not a close friend of his, just a nodding acquaintance. A couple of times I gave him some laundry to wash. That's it.
Inscrutable are God's ways. A man born an emperor of a great country worked in the laundry in the Gulag and ended his life working as a gardener at his own imperial palace. All his life, Chabua had been an obstinately determined man. Although he ceased his escapes, his fight continued with the same zeal. With the coming of a mature age and the accumulation of life's experiences, a realization of the true strength of the enormous number of prisoners kept behind the barbed wires of the Gulag had added strength to his own inner craving for freedom. Chabua came to understand that it was this force that promised salvation. The main thing was always be aware of the trends around you and stand up to the end. Having this in mind, Chabua organized and participated in the strikes and the riots of the prisoners, never bowing to either the prison wardens or officials, or to the cynicism and inhumanity of the regime. And despite the strict punishments, he continued to be an example of immutable strength and steadfastness to his fellow prisoners. But what occurred in 1953 can justly be called the most important achievement of his Gulag career. On March 20th, 1953, the news of Stalin's death quickly spread throughout the Gulag. But the Khrushchev reforms did not overnight make things better for the Soviet citizens.
12 Սինამდვილեში, 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 12 Սինამდვილեში
In reality, it was the wave of Gulag uprisings which shook the country that became the first impulse for the authorities to soften the existing regime to a certain degree. The apogee of this wave was a grandiose rebellion of the prisoners' camps in the transpolar Norilsk region, where beginning with 1952, the officials inadvertently started to gather all the instigators of riots from all over the Soviet Union.
At least 60,000 prisoners were involved, the greatest event in the history of the Gulag, and Chabua Amiredjibi became one of its chief organizers.
We convinced local prisoners and involved them in this, and that's how the strike began.
Initially, we decided not to go out to work. The strike was staged. The management was taken off guard. You cannot coerce thousands of people to work. They tried to break up the camps in different sectors to better control them, but this didn't help them either. The strike committees were organized immediately.
The main strike committee was organized on a parity basis. The committee comprised 3 Ukrainians, a representative of the Caucasus, which was me, 1 Russian, 1 Lithuanian, 1 Latvian or Estonian, 7 people all told.
The members of this committee worked out a list of 12 demands addressed to the government and the Politburo of the USSR. The text of the demands was drafted together with one of the members of the committee and written by Chabua personally. The basic demands were provided in the last 2 paragraphs of this letter. The first was the liquidation of the OSO, the state body that was authorized to pass sentences, including death sentences, in the absence of the indicted. And the second, a review of all the political cases ever tried by the KGB. In the meantime, the situation in the camps of Norilsk region was daily becoming more tense. On May 3, 1953, a new twist was added to the prisoners' strike.
We were on strike. Next to our camp, beyond the barbed wire, there was a women's camp. The Ukrainian boys used to walk there to chat with their compatriots. During one such episode, people were shot from the guard tower. That triggered an enormous outrage. 6,000 women were screaming in unison. Jesus, it was horrible. An uprising followed.
This news quickly spread to the other departments, and all the Norilsk camps went on strike.
The situation was getting dangerously out of hand. Black flags, which were symbols of disobedience, were hoisted above the barracks of all the camps on the Taimyr Peninsula, and all work halted at the construction sites and the mines. The free population of the region was in a panic. The local authorities had trenches dug and soldiers with submachine guns waiting to lay siege to the camps. They were awaiting orders from Moscow. In the long run, after many failed attempts to intimidate the rebels with terror tactics and death, the significance of the uprising finally dawned on the officials. In July of 1953, good news started coming from Moscow.
Then by and by, they started to meet our demands. 3 of our demands were met immediately. They promised us to meet other demands as well. We didn't trust them, so we continued. Thus, one by one, they satisfied all of our demands.
The gratification of the rebels' demands by the new supreme authorities of the country meant not only softening of the Gulag regime, but, as the history has shown, also the beginning of the forced revision of the principles and methods of the totalitarian system as a whole. Those few positive steps in the internal policy of the USSR, which are associated with Khrushchev's name, in reality were the first steps for the retention of power, which were brought about mainly by the Gulag uprisings of 1952-53.
The officials knew us leaders. We were relocated to the prisons and put to solitary confinement cells. I was transferred to the special prison. My luck again, as solitaries were all full.
The Norilsk uprising soon yielded results. Review of all cases and sometimes amnesty ensued. The relatives of Chabua appealed to many institutions to release him, but they still had to wait a long time. Before 1950, they had hoped that he was still alive, as there had been no indication of his death. And after that, they saw him only a couple of times. However, Chabua managed to take care of his responsibilities, even from jail.
К сожалению, я впервые увидела своего отца в 1958 году, летом, когда...
Unfortunately, I first saw my father only in the summer of 1958, when my grandmother and my aunt first took me to his camp. Before that, I was only receiving the letters, and strangely enough, even gifts from the camp. My mother was astounded at how he managed to send me an enormous parcel containing a bicycle when I turned 7. Only later we found out how hard he had to work in the camp to bring me this happiness. In 1950, I was 16 years old. We went to see Chabua in the jail. We were taken into a long hall sealed with steel bars. Chabua was led out and I recognized him instantly, but he didn't recognize me and he was quite surprised. "Who is this girl?" he asked. And when I said, "Chabua, this is me, Natia," only then did he recognize me and started crying. I had remained an 8-year-old girl in his memory. He covered his face with his hands and cried. He couldn't help it. We were ushered in the visitors' room. This was a room with steel bars all around. Then the door opened and a tall, handsome man, dressed in civilian clothes, appeared at the doorway. Somehow he had made a deal with the prison warden that the next day I would be permitted into the camp. To be honest, I hated the place. He showed me the barracks where they lived. He showed me the bed he slept on. He introduced me to his campmates. Then he gave me a present, which I've kept ever since. He made a small chest from different sorts of wood, which, as I remember, looked very beautiful, and he said that he had made it especially for me.
качестве подарка мне. У кого-то из заключенных...
One of the prisoners had a photo camera, and on the second day of my visit, Father wanted to take a picture with me. We started to walk around, and walked for a long time. I didn't understand why Father was looking for a place for the picture, which was eventually taken so zealously. I asked him, "What do you mean when you tell me it spoils the sight?" He answered, "There are so many gratings on the windows here. I don't want you to remember these gratings and the camp. I simply want you to remember that we met, and that this was our first meeting. This is the way life should be." Next morning we left the place, but about a month later he sent me a letter to which he enclosed this picture where we are together. And in the letter he asked whether I remembered how I'd been looking for a place without gratings. "Sorry, we didn't really manage," he wrote. "You will still notice them in the background."
Despite all the political changes, Chabua's life in the Gulag dragged on endlessly. He waited for amnesty until 1959, but he had already achieved freedom, a freedom even in captivity.
You can achieve freedom in captivity only in one way. If you have a sense of humor and can look at these things with humor, then you're a free man. Nothing holds you back. Nothing makes you angry. You do what you want. You are free of your passion. Only those people endure in captivity who view their destiny with humor. If a man starts grumbling and bemoaning his fate, how could this happen to me? What happens to my family, my relatives, and what will the future be? This kind of man will not make it. He will probably survive only 5 or 6 years. Then he will likely fall ill with inherited or acquired disease and die.
One pleasant day, November 26, 1959, Chabua was playing basketball in a camp yard. An officer approached and said that the prisoner Amiredjibi was free. Half of the game remained to be played. Instead of leaving the camp immediately, Chabua finished the game, won it, bid farewell to his friends, and only then did he leave the Gulag. His amnesty had been ensued. He was 38 years old. So ended the Gulag odyssey of a man who was twice sentenced to be shot, but survived miraculously. A man who earned 83 years in prison sentences. After winning his freedom, this man raised 6 children, became a writer, and one of the most famous people in Georgia, and later in the Soviet Union. In 1996, his novel was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. This man has many more stories from his Gulag days and lives on with the same zeal and passion for life that is evident in his history. The Soviet Empire, even with its Gulag camps, could not outlast him.
They haven't managed to break me.